All right. We'll look at the organization and the origin of the church. The church is officially called, if I haven't made this clear, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Sometimes referred to as LDS, which is okay to call it that. It's not impolite. Sometimes they call themselves Mormons. This was a name that was attached to them. You'll see why, if you don't know already where that name comes from. And I just wanted to give you just a quick thumbnail sketch of how their church is arranged. At the top of the ecclesiastical hierarchy is the president of their church. He is, in their view, a prophet who is capable of receiving new revelation from God. I think the last Mormon president who actually received a revelation, I think was, if my memory doesn't fail me, was in the late 70s. So it doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen from time to time. He has that capacity to set forth new doctrine, qualify old doctrine if the need arises, perhaps even, I suppose, write new scripture if the need arose for that as well. Generally, the president will be somebody who has risen through the ranks of the other ecclesiastical levels. And then once he achieves this status, having been chosen by some of his colleagues, sort of analogous to how the Pope, who's elected by cardinals, the president of the church is more or less designated by his associates, then he will carry that position till his death. And then they'll look for a new one. He has two men who serve as his counselor, and so this trio together are often referred to as the first presidency. Then the first presidency works with a board of 12 men who are apostles. They are the 12 apostles. If you remember my story from last week, I think it was, when the Mormon came to my house and asked me if my church had apostles, and I said yes. And he was startled because he knows that typical evangelical churches don't use that expression. And when he pressed me on it, what I was being sort of facetious, but I was deliberately trying to be provocative, was that our apostles are the apostles of the Bible. Peter, Paul, these kind of guys are still apostling for us. But they have 12 living apostles. Now, there is then underneath this hierarchy of the 12 apostles with the first presidency, a group of 70 men called the 70s. And this constitutes, by and large, the paid clergy. So when you see a Mormon building, a Mormon church, none of the staff at that church are paid. They are what you might refer to as bivocational. There's really not a full-time pastor that goes that works in the local churches. So groups of Mormons geographically are grouped together in what are called wards. So you may have any number of wards that cover a geographic area, and if you've got enough concentration, sometimes there's an intermediate ecclesiastical level called a stake, where it's basically just to facilitate a lot of the operations of the churches. By and large, the local church would be a ward. And if you ever are inclined to visit a Mormon church, you will be quite welcome. They would be thrilled to have you come and visit there, just as you would be thrilled to have them come and visit. They're the same. So it's nothing secret or anything that goes on that they don't want you to see. The ward is overseen by a bishop who is analogous to our pastor, but again, he's not a paid position. It's something he just does out of the goodness of his heart. All right, now there's a lot more to say. I'm sure some of you are curious perhaps about the temple, for example. A temple, there are only a handful of temples, Mormon temples around the world. A temple is different than the building that you see. A temple isn't something that you could just go to indiscriminately. In fact, many Mormons can't go to the temple indiscriminately. There are portions of the temple that are actually off limits until you've met a certain ecclesiastical criteria to get in, called the temple recommend, where you get a certain certificate from your bishop that bona fides you as having paid your tithe correctly, having obeyed certain types of dietary restrictions and these other kinds of restrictions that make you eligible to go into the temple and go through the temple ceremonies. Usually when a temple is built, this is kind of interesting, before it's consecrated for the Mormons' use, it is open to non-Mormons or anybody that otherwise wouldn't be qualified to go in. So you can take a tour and see at least most of the building that would otherwise be off limits. And then once it's sort of consecrated, then you can only go past certain places in the temple once you've met certain criteria. We may have occasion to say a little bit more about the temple in due course, but for the sake of time, I want to just press on and get some other things out on the table. So what is the origin? Where does it come from? Well, you're all familiar with the Book of Mormon, perhaps. I have mine with me tonight. Purportedly, it covers a history ranging from about 2000 BC to just the 5th century AD. It's a chronicles of a number of people group migrations and then the subsequent wars that ensued over the course of centuries between the descendants of these various people groups. So it purports to be an account of the history of 3 groups of people that migrated from the ancient world and settled on the Americas. Now, just so there won't be any misunderstanding as to what I think about this, none of this is true. Okay? None of this is historically verified. There's absolutely no archaeological evidence for it whatsoever. True. It doesn't have to be confirmed archaeologically for them to believe that it actually took place, and you'll see why that's the case here in due course. So the earliest civilization were the Jaredite civilization that left from the land of the Tower of Babel shortly after the tower was destroyed approximately 4,000 years ago or 2000 BC. So the account of the Jaredites is in the book of Ether in the Book of Mormon. So you can come read that if you want. The Jaredites established a civilization in the Americas that flourished for almost 2,000 years, right up to the time of Christ, according to the book. They finally disintegrated by internal conflicts and a final total war. The second migration was the Nephite civilization that took place around 600 BC. The prophet Lehi and his friend Ishmael took their families into the wilderness. Eventually, they crossed the ocean to the Americas and established a great civilization. The rebellious group called themselves Lamanites after Laman, the most powerful and forceful member. And the Lord later placed a curse of dark skin on the Lamanites. When later certain Lamanites became believers, they became, quote, white and delightsome, and were called Nephites. Throughout their history, there were times when the Lamanites were more faithful than the Nephites. As a result of their corruption, the Nephites were eventually destroyed by war. Some Nephites survived and mixed with the Lamanites and the Mulekites, which we'll say something about in a second. And the remnant has become what we now know as the American Indians. Okay, so that's where the American Indians came from, according to the story. They are the residue of the melding of these people groups that immigrated or migrated, I suppose, from the Middle East. The third migration, about 11 years after Lehi left Jerusalem, was the Mulekite, although that name does not occur in the Book of Mormon. Mulek, the son of Zedekiah, and his followers crossed the ocean and settled in the Americas. The people of Mulek eventually merged with the Nephite Lamanite, and what are now known as American Indians. All right, so all of this, the wars that ensued and the rising and falling of these various civilizations, and then the residuals from that, is sort of what the subject matter of the Book of Mormon is. That's basically what it's all about. That's hard. Yeah, it is. So while Mormons claim that the Book of Mormon contains the fullness of the everlasting gospel, that's a phrase you'll hear them use a lot, virtually none of the distinctive doctrines of Mormonism, that is, doctrines that distinguish Mormonism from Christianity, are found in the book. Now you might wonder, okay, well then why do they tout this book as opposed to other books? You're going to see why that is. If we don't get to it tonight, we'll certainly be done with it by the end of next week. There's a reason why. It's the Book of Mormon that they usually lead out with when they come to your house. It's the Book of Mormon that they'll give you for free. It's the Book of Mormon you can call the 800 number and get a free copy sent to your house. And it's the Book of Mormon they want you to read. So you might find it sort of, it's like, well, why would they do that if it's the case that everything that's distinctive about them, which they certainly want you to come to believe, is missing from the Book of Mormon. There's a reason for that. Most of the distinctive doctrines of Mormonism come from Joseph Smith's other writings, the Doctrine and Covenants, we talked about this last week, and the Pearl of Great Price. The Doctrine and Covenants is by and large a collection of visions that Joseph Smith claimed to have had, where God speaks to him and he's just writing these things. And there may be anywhere from a paragraph to several pages where God's directing doctrine and organization and various activities. You know, God tells Joseph Smith to go tell this guy to go do that and that stuff. So it's a whole bunch, and that's where most of the distinctive theology comes from. So how did it come to us today from, you know, these migrations? Who's writing these stories, and how did it end up in Joseph Smith's hands? The story of the events of the Book of Mormon was written by many ancient prophets. Okay, so young people especially, I don't want you to be misled here. None of this is true. Okay, this is just what I'm just telling you their story. We'll talk about how we know it's not true here before the end of next week. But just understand, I'm just saying this is how they tell their story. So the history of the events of the Book of Mormon was written by many ancient prophets. They kept their records on metal plates and handed, down from one generation to the next. One of the prophets, named Mormon, so this is how the name eventually gets introduced, abridged the major portions of the plates into the record that we have today. So Mormon was one of the last prophets to write on the Book of Mormon plates. Purportedly they were golden plates. You perhaps have heard some of this story. And then again, he purportedly lived around AD 310 to AD 385. The Book of Mormon was named for him because of the major roles he played as writer and as abridger of the plates. So in other words, you have all these prophets writing, keeping these tedious and extended records, and then he winnows that down into a manageable story. And since he also contributes to the story, but because he's the major editor, if you will, the book gets named after him. His successor was his son, Moroni. Moroni buried the plates in the hill Cumorah, which is now in upstate New York. That's actually a real place. Okay, there actually is a place called Hill Cumorah. If you go down Mullinax, if you take a shortcut instead of going down at McFarland, you cut off from Highway 9 down to come out, you know, down a little bit further, that road Mullen. Look at some of the street names as you look. There's a neighborhood that's named after a number of these city places and other things there next time you go down. So Cumorah is actually a real place in New York. So Moroni dies about AD 421. All right, so now the plates are buried. So in 1827, the story goes, Moroni, as a resurrected being, appears to Joseph Smith and eventually would lead Joseph Smith to where the plates are. Sorry, I'm cutting and pasting this from prose and from bullet points when I was reformatting this, so sometimes the gender or the tense of the verbs don't carry exactly like they should have. So Joseph Smith Jr. translates the plates, which are purportedly written in, quote, Reformed Egyptian. Okay, you see my fingers doing this? Okay, that's the quotation marks around. So he gets these plates from this being that tells him where they're buried, and then he has this particular procedure whereby he's able to translate the plates. Now, Mormons think that right after, by the way, I didn't say this a while ago, but part of the story of these people groups, that since it carries all the way up to 400 AD, is that supposedly Jesus appears to them after he was raised from the dead in the first century. Then he flits over to the New World and appears to the people over there and preaches to them. So that's where they get the gospel. Okay, but you jump ahead. All right, but when Jesus comes and dies, rises from the dead, ascends, and starts the church, the Mormons believe that immediately thereafter there was basically a complete apostasy where all the truths that Jesus had taught through all of his apostles got completely lost. So they believe there's a great apostasy. Mormons believe that the Bible predicted a great apostasy or falling away, and that truths of the gospel were lost. And they get this out of 2 Thessalonians. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away come first. I would submit to your consideration that this is still future. This is talking about the consummation of history. It's not talking about what happened 2 days after Jesus ascends. But we can carry that argument on in another context. So, when mankind rejected God's apostles, God removed the priesthood authority from the church and from the earth. This is very key here, because having the priesthood, whatever that means, is essential in their minds of having the authority to speak, teach, baptize, and minister in the name of Christ. So they, knowing as they think they know, that no other church has that authority, then in their minds, churches like Midway are just totally futile. Nothing that we do here, in their estimation, is worth anything. Baptisms, confessions, repentance, nothing. It's because it doesn't, in their understanding, it isn't done under the auspices of this priesthood authority that had been taken away, and as you can imagine, must have been restored at some point. So when the people rejected the truth and killed the apostles, God took the priesthood authority from the church and the earth. The loss of revelation through the church led to great confusion, contention, and incorrect teaching. This falling away of the truth is called the apostasy. All right, that's a quote out of one of the pamphlets I have up here with me. So, the priesthood is the authority to act in the name of God in the salvation of men. There's another quote from Bruce McConkie. "It's the power by which the gospel is preached, by which the ordinances of salvation are performed, so that they will be binding on earth and in heaven, by which men are sealed up unto eternal life, being assured of the fullness of the Father's kingdom hereafter, and by which in due course the Lord will govern the nations of the earth and all that pertains to them." So you have to have this authority. There are two priesthoods, although they're often thought of as one, the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthood. The office of the Aaronic priesthood comprises the deacon, the teacher, the priest, and the bishop. And the Melchizedek priesthood is the elder. That would be like the young men who came the first night. If you got a chance to talk to them, or perhaps you've talked to some that have come to your home, and they will have their badges on, and they'll have like Elder Williams or Elder Blackman. That's a title of an office that they possess, having been bestowed on them through a ritual in their church. So we sort of chortle when we see some guy 19 years old referring to himself as an elder. He's a sophomore, okay? That's what we call them. We call them sophomores. We don't call them elders. The reason in the Bible that the word elder is attached to the leaders of the church is because, as you learn even from your Old Testament, if not learning it from life itself, there's generally a statistical correlation between a person's age and his wisdom. A person who's walking with God learns the exigencies of life, and so a person who is, quote-unquote, an elder, that is older in the community, by and large will be someone who has deeper insights into practical Christian living. And that's why you have this title that's a chronological title that also becomes a title of church leadership, spiritual leadership. The 70 we mentioned before, and others, including all the way up to the apostles. And then, of course, the apostles would be where the president would come from, the prophet of the church. Thus, because of the apostasy, the authority of the act in the name of God was removed. No church since that time has had the authority to act in God's name, according to Mormons. It was necessary, therefore, for God to restore the gospel truths and the priesthood authority.